Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, with Zelensky out of options due to the U.S. desperately wanting out of the Ukraine conflict, the real question that has to be asked is if any quote unquote peace agreement will have any true sustainability.
Yeah, absolutely. But first, I think it's worth noting recent developments. And to be honest, there's an awful lot of claims, counterclaims, misinformation, misunderstanding about what's going on with the entire peace process. So there's this many points, now it's this many points, etc., etc. And we're not going to focus on that because it's nothing of any real interest. But what I think is highly interesting is how suddenly, for some reason, and we'll explain why, the US military started to send personnel to meet with Ukrainian officials in Kiev with respect to a peace agreement or future peace agreement. For me, that raised a massive alarm bell because A, it's not something that would typically happen. B, then the question is, why are they there? And then C, most importantly, what did they actually have to say? Now, amongst several military officials, and there's no point going on about all of them, there was US Army Secretary Dan Driscoll, who clearly gave Ukraine a pretty serious assessment of where the war was, in that basically, sorry, Ukraine, but the situation on the battlefield is dire, to put it diplomatically. You have no chance of winning this war. You are, in fact, about to suffer a very serious defeat in a very compressed period of time. We're not putting days or weeks on this, but imminent in the context of what that would mean militarily. And in essence, there was a number of points to this. Firstly, Driscoll said to the Ukrainians, look, not only are you not capable of fighting the war anymore, but Russia is capable and is ramping up every aspect of their special military operation, and but made reference to aerial attacks, and that in essence they have the ability to fight this war, quote, indefinitely, meaning exactly what Russia said. We can fight this war for 5 years, 10 years, as long as is necessary. Therefore, the argument is, and we've said this ourselves countless times in recent months, and in fact, going back even further than that, the situation's only going to get worse for Ukraine as the days and weeks go by. Meaning, today, you may be able to settle on the basis of the 5 regions. Next week or next month, it could be 6 regions, 7 regions, 10 regions, half of Ukraine. Therefore, you need to negotiate a peace settlement now rather than ending up in a situation where things are 5, 10, 20 times worse than they are now. It's a statement of the obvious, but why would you send military personnel? Because when they talk to the military personnel on the other side of the table, from the Ukraine side, they'll get far more respect with the military person saying it rather than no disrespect to anyone else who's part of this Trump administration's diplomacy team to end the war. They are simply talking the same language as the other side will therefore be receptive to. But it gets even worse, really, because the United States also had to come out and admit to the Ukrainians, look, again, this is no surprise, but when the Americans admitted to the Ukrainians, you realize how bad things are, that, look, we quite simply are unable to supply you, Ukraine, with the weapons, defense systems at a rate you need to protect yourselves, meaning your country's infrastructure, your population, and therefore, on the basis of those assessments, you've lost, and you need to accept a deal. there's no more prevarication, there's no more convincing yourselves that, excuse me, the white knights, meaning the United States, is going to come over the hill and give you everything you need to defeat Russia. You're not going to defeat them. You've lost the war. The longer this drags on, the worse the outcome's going to be. Oh, and by the way, we, the United States, are in no position to be able to arm you in any way, shape, or form that would allow you to be able to continue to fight the war. I mean, that is about as damning an assessment as you're going to get. But I think, in a sense, it was a sensible decision to make because the Ukrainians needed to hear reality. Otherwise, they would have just carried on going, well, we can keep fighting this war. What's the problem? You can keep arming us. You can keep giving us money. So we'll keep mobilizing people, even if they are 70 years of age or 15. I'm exaggerating for a fact, but 18-year-olds or whatever. Well, they're simply being told that's irrelevant now. That is not going to help you. And therefore, you're going to have to factor that into your thinking about how this war ends and when this war ends. And there's no more second chances, no more reprieves, no more miracles that you may think or anyone else might think is going to change the course of this war. Now, the other interesting part is in telling the Ukrainians this, the Europeans must now be aware of this. So they're going to sit there and go, or should sit there and go, well, that means the Americans have got nothing to give us to then give to the Ukrainians. So are we going to moderate our attitude and behavior in terms of how this war ends? Well, that remains to be seen. What we do know is, or apparently we do know, is, and I'm not going to, even though I said we wouldn't discuss this, I'm just going to mention one thing, that they've gone from 28 points on this framework, which isn't a plan anyone's agreed to. Let's stress that, because there's been too much people going, how did Russia agree to this? Why did they've agreed to nothing. They don't even know what this revised plan is. They're their words, not mine. But now it's 19 points and some things are being watered down, some things are being removed. And as things stand, it seems highly unlikely Russia's going to agree to any of this. But when you're told, in essence, you're losing the war, you face imminent defeat, there is no way out of this. We, the United States, can't do anything to help you either. Really, if that doesn't make the Ukrainians sit there and go, well, we have zero leverage in these discussions. We're going to have to take it on the chin, accept whatever Russia's prepared to negotiate, because if we don't, next week, next month, they're going to come back and make even bigger demands. And if we refuse then the demands will just get bigger and bigger and bigger as the weeks and months progress. And therefore, the next question is, what does Zelensky now think about this? Because if he's had a dose of reality dealt to him, which frankly is way overdue, is he really going to sit there and feel now he's in a position to dictate anything? Well, logically, no, because when you get that sort of assessment, in any other point in history, you'd be raising the white flag and surrendering today, never mind tomorrow.
Yeah, indeed. And, there's two big things recently that have stuck out in regards to this. You mentioned about the first one. I think this is the first time in the negotiating settlement or environment that an actual someone from the Pentagon, the Secretary of the Army, not the Secretary of Defense or the War Department, but the Secretary of the Army came out and gave a direct assessment and is part of the negotiating team, saying this is what the reality is on the ground and these are what your real options are. Secondly, Zelensky, of course, after the blueprint that the United States presented to both Russia and to Ukraine to end the conflict, first thing he does is he wants to have a personal face-to-face with Trump, just like he has done with Europe and has able to schmooze and con them into keep on giving him stuff and pursuing the conflict. And Trump said no. The next time we will meet face to face is when we are signing the absolute peace agreement deal. So right there, that's a realization, or should be a realization, that the United States has pulled out of this alliance and wants nothing more to do with it. The problem is, in my opinion, is Europe. But of course, we have to take with a grain of salt everything that these European leaders say. But the problem is that when they come out and say it publicly, and I'll give an example, the foreign affairs secretary, vice president of the EU, Kaja Kallas, came out and said that there will be no agreement signed without us being a part of it. Well, the reality is that the EU or NATO should no longer have any say at all in this, in any peace agreement, ceasefire, etc. They're supposed to not be a combatant. But with that being said, if Europe keeps doing this rhetoric and offers little carrots here and there, 1.5 billion to help with the infrastructure, or we're gonna supply whatever arms, et cetera, et cetera, it keeps giving Zelensky and his administration more emphasis to continue to fight the conflict that they are inevitably losing, and but more importantly, trying to keep themselves in power. And I think that's the real crux of it, is they don't want to give up power. They could care less about winning the conflict.
Yeah, it's true, but they can give in carrots, but they're nearly out of carrots now, as we know, because money's not going to do anything. The Americans basically saying we can't arm you anymore. Then Europe depends on those arms from the Americans. So without the Americans, what are they going to give them? Nothing. So they're running it. They themselves are going to run out of road in terms of what they can give. And as you said, and we said this before we came on air, 1.5 billion to rebuild Ukraine. What are they going to build with that? A few supermarkets? Ukraine needs 500 billion, maybe a trillion. Who knows, maybe even more dollars equivalent to rebuild the country. So it's just meaningless. But you made a great point, Ken, and we discussed this before we came on air, was how do you have a peace agreement that you can actually seriously keep him enforce it and make sure it's lasting? So for argument's sake, we're talking in 10 years' time about, do you remember that conversation we had in 2025? Well, that peace agreement that was signed, whenever it's signed, actually stood the test of time, and there hasn't been any war since, or any diplomatic or worse incident that violated the terms of that agreement. And I think that was a great point you made, Ken, that how do you keep a peace agreement like this in place?
One of the hardest things to take a look at is when you have two diametrically opposed enemies, say during World War II, Germany and Russia. Of course, when a peace agreement is done, there at least is a capitulation on one of the other sides. But when you have a conflict between uh, similar cultures, usually, and historically, let's take an example. China and Taiwan are still separate. North Korea and South Korea are still separate, going back 50 to 70 to 80 years. Okay? These things do not end with simply signing a name on a piece of paper. Ukraine has always been a part of Russia's history, and vice versa, going back to the 1300s. So the animosity that will carry over no matter what ceasefire or so-called peace agreement, there'll always be these little you know things that are, events that take place that can potentially scuttle any type of peace agreement. And when you take a look at it, we already have precedent. The Minsk agreement, which um, Chancellor Merkel even admitted was just to allow Ukraine to rearm. We have precedent in during the Vietnam conflict when the U.S. was involved in there. There were three or four different ceasefires similar to the Minsk agreements, and all it did was allow the North Vietnamese to rearm and continue the conflict. So that's why I think Russia has focused more on accumulating and acquiring the necessary geography that it has, taking out the infrastructure, because the only way this will succeed and there will be lasting peace is, in my opinion, one, the U.S. has to be behind it because they're going to be the ones pressuring Europe. Europe has to be willing to rein in and not be petulant children and try to coerce the conflict going on. And third, there has to be some sort of definitive ending Kiev's capacity to conduct war. Now, if they do other types of little things, along border skirmishes and whatever, we see that in India and Pakistan all the time. That can be dealt with, but it's their capacity to conduct war that needs to be entirely eliminated. And in my opinion, also a change in government where the people want the conflict to end and they put in representatives and elected officials that are going to focus on that.
Yeah, absolutely. But also, I think it relates to the fact that because there's a lot of discussion as to how big a Ukrainian army should be in the future, what weapons they're allowed to hold. The other question is, uh, look at the issue of NATO encroachment towards Russia. I mean, you can sit there and sign an agreement that says Ukraine will never be part of NATO, but I can guarantee there'll be people in the background going, "Well, once Putin's gone, we'll make it happen. Don't worry, we'll make it happen then." I mean, and then if we have, then we're just going to have an instant conflict again. Okay, they can write terms and conditions and say, well, if Ukraine starts firing missiles into Russia, then this peace agreement's null and void, and Russia can please themselves. But they don't have to do that. They just have to start making noises in the future. Well, maybe, a few years have gone by, so now we can start reconsidering Ukraine's position with respect to NATO, and that's going to lead to instant war. So, how do you stop the war? How do you, as we've just said, prevent it uh, reigniting or the conflict reigniting? And how do you put measures in place to ensure, I mean, that there's trust? I mean, if we're going to be objective, I mean, from the Ukrainian perspective, are they ever going to trust the Russians for the foreseeable future? The answer is no. Russia certainly isn't going to trust the Ukrainians. So if there's no trust on either side, then the risk of a conflict reigniting is way, way higher than it would be ordinarily. And you make the point, Ken, because of the history between the two countries and what's gone on, that just adds to, throwing more petrol on the fire. And therefore, the conclusion you come to is going to be one thing getting everyone to sign a peace agreement, but to enforce it and make it lasting is going to be extremely difficult. Because, if you do have a UN Security Council resolution that says, and it's written into Ukraine's constitution, that we're not going to ever be part of NATO, well, if they tear up their constitution and remove that line item, what then? Does that mean then that all protection afforded under that agreement is null and void? Well, if it is, then what? And if they don't do anything, Russia's response is going to be, well, we have to take military action again because now NATO membership's back on the table. So, given what Russia's core issues are, whether people agree or disagree is irrelevant. they are what they are, and in trying to enforce them, it's going to be extremely difficult to get the Ukrainians to agree to any of those core issues. They're already making noises to that degree. So this whatever this new version is going to be that the Ukrainians have more or less agreed to, is Russia even going to agree to that? It seems highly unlikely or nearly impossible. And so how are they even going to get to the point that that becomes a reality, that they can have an agreement? And if they don't, the war carries on, then and on and on. And Russia takes more land, territory, more regions. There's more destruction. Huge amounts of Ukrainians continue to die. That's going to make a future peace agreement even harder to achieve. So you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. There's no obvious resolution to this as things stand. And this is something that politicians don't care about, because all the Trump administration wants to do is go, see, we got a peace agreement. We told you we'd do this. We're the nation of peace. Oh, and we get all these fringe benefits, signing all these economic deals and financial deals and et cetera, et cetera. So it's win-win, and that's all politicians care about. Once they're out of office, they're going to turn around and go, well, we didn't cause that. But ultimately, if they don't reach a proper agreement that's sustainable, then they're really just, as I've said, creating a sort of permanent ceasefire rather than an agreement until someone decides they don't like something, and then the war reignites. And if the West thinks waiting for Putin to leave office is the answer, they're very foolish, because whoever takes over could be far more hardline, is likely to be far more hardline. They won't go for a special military operation. They'll say, right, this time we're not spending 3, 4, 5 years, whatever it is, fighting a war on that basis. This is a war we will end in a few days. But no one cares, because by then it's so far off in the distance. None of these politicians in the West will even probably be in office anymore. That's a huge problem as well.
Yeah, and I think the last thing I want to point out is while the West may be waiting for Putin to leave office, the fact of the matter is that because the United States and even Europe changes their upper leadership so often, the Minsk agreement was signed under when Trump was in his first time, but the next president came in, gave the green light, supported with money and arms, and the conflict raged again. And now Trump is trying to re-pull everything back to what he had signed. If somebody wants to claim responsibility, I created the peace. Well, guess what? The moment that you're gone, that peace will crumble because it was held together by the power and charisma of a single, iconoclast, a cult of personality. So what happens when the next president comes in? We already know Congress, at least in its current state, is, as warmongering as it gets. The Pentagon is more than happy, that's their job. So it's really a difficult scenario where inevitably, and I think everybody, who's thought this out knows it, Russia has to dictate the end of the war. No one else. They can be involved, but they don't get the final say.
Well, yeah, you ultimately have to have an agreement between two sides. But I mean, the final point I would make is, even if Russia got every core issue nailed down in the agreement, still doesn't mean it's enforceable. And it's going to remain enforceable. So through 2026 to 2036, 46, and 56, or whenever, how far out we extrapolate this, that's the problem. So, and of course, the more Russia gets in terms of its core issues, and if they're all dealt with, the more likely the conflict's going to resurface at some point in the future. And if they're not, the conflict's not going to end. And then the only question then is, the conflict will end when Ukraine completely capitulates. But if Ukraine capitulates, that is not really a solution either, because that would, to be honest, I think make uh, whatever peace agreement you put in place would instantly be unenforceable. I think there would be so much animosity and hatred that towards the Russians because they capitulated Ukraine and they were totally humiliated. You may even see regions that, if the war ended now, they may have referendum in the future and want to be part of Russia. You can't rule out the possibility if things get so bad. Not Donetsk and Lugansk, but Kherson might want another referendum and go, well, after that, I think we want to be part of Ukraine again. And people say, don't be ridiculous, but it's a complicated country. Yes, there's ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians, but equally, the question is of with the people there who are ethnic Russians, they've already had the opportunity. They could have left and gone to Russia, but they've stayed because that's their homeland. So things could get so bad that Russia then starts to suffer problems within, not, as I say, Donetsk, Lugansk. I mean, I'm not saying it will happen, but there's a risk of it. If you create a scenario where a country completely folds, then it might seem great for the victor, but in the long term, it is not a situation that anybody should want to see happen because I fear the ramifications will be very serious going forward.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to think of how long animosity or resentment can last, just take a look at China and Japan right now. Paul, were there any other final thoughts you wanted to add to this?
No, I think your comments about China and Japan eloquently highlights the point.
Perfect. To everybody here at the Sirius Report community, as always, thank you for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.